Thank you again, everybody, for being here. This is our third in a series on spiritual transformation or spiritual awakening. And this week, we're going to look at sudden transformation. Now, in our world of instant gratification, sudden transformation without the discomfort of all the spiritual discipline over years is definitely, I think, the preferred method of spiritual awakening. Correct me if I'm wrong. But let's start with a reminder about what we mean by spiritual awakening, and then we'll examine what a spontaneous or sudden spiritual awakening is through a real life example. Now, forgive me, but I squeezed the definition all in one slide here. So if you have trouble seeing it, then shame on me, but you're just going to have to lean in and listen carefully if you can't make out all the words. Here it is. Spiritual awakening is a term given to describe a subjective experience in which an individual's ego transcends their ordinary, finite sense of self to encompass a wider, infinite sense of truth or reality. These deeply embodied noetic experiences, and remember, noetic has to do with mental life, noetic experiences are often perceived as a direct connection, communion, or non-dual merging with an unlimited and universal consciousness, the divine or God in perceived oneness. Experiences of spiritual awakening, whether gradual or sudden, intentionally induced or spontaneous, typically evoke an ineffable sense of deep inner knowing, understanding, remembering, or unveiling of one's true nature, as well as experiences of peace and equanimity, bliss, ecstasy and aliveness, feelings of awe, sacredness, gratitude and reverence, and of abundant, unconditional love. These profound experiences may also trigger a sense of transcendence of time and space, as well as an increase in physical and mental sensitivity to internal and external stimuli, including sensitivity to color, light, touch, sounds, and smells. Now, I know that's a lot to take in, but hopefully you get the sense that it's something that we all might welcome into our life. Now, the above description most often occurs as the result of following a tried and true spiritual program, such as the 5 stages of the mystic, which I presented a couple of weeks ago, or one of the various strands of Buddhism, like the Nichiren branch, which I discussed last week. All of them are based in forms of contemplation and meditation as sort of the driving force. But the description of spiritual awakening I just gave also appears to have happened suddenly and all at once to one of the most well-known of today's spiritual teachers, Eckhart Tolle, who is most famous for his book, The Power of Now. Now, if you haven't heard of Eckhart Tolle, I'm very surprised, because anybody who watches Oprah Winfrey or any of the major news network channels or something has no doubt encountered him at some point, I would think. I would like to summarize Tolle's account of his conversion. I got this from an interview he made with Sounds True founder and CEO Tammy Simon, which is actually based here in Boulder County. I think it's in Louisville now. Used to be downtown Boulder. The interview is available on YouTube if you care to look it up. Just look up Eckhart Tolle and Tammy Simon on YouTube. Tolle was a doctoral student in London, England, in his late 20s and had suffered for much of his life with severe depression, including suicidal thoughts and bouts of intense anxiety. Now, this is significant since studies in the field indicate that sudden spiritual awakening most frequently emerge following periods of prolonged psychological turmoil or trauma. That's according to the Frontiers in Psychology website. Well, one night, after a period of anxiety and restlessness that was preventing him from falling asleep, he had the sensation that the objects in his room were very alien to him. In fact, he felt completely alienated from the world. He thought to himself at that moment that the burden of living was just too much for him. He then thought these words, "I can't live with myself. I can't live with myself." And then suddenly he became aware of that statement, I can't live with myself, as merely a thought. Well, who was having the thought? Surely not the I in the sentence, I can't live with myself, because someone else, another I, was observing the thought. He then reasoned, there must be two of me, the person who is suffering and can't live with himself anymore, and the person making an observation about the suffering person. He said that his last real thought that night before his awakening was, who am I? And what is that self that I can't live with? You see, he had separated himself from the thought about himself, if that makes sense. And he suddenly realized that this person, this self that he could no longer live with, wasn't real. He did not experience this as a logical progression of reasoning. His rational faculties were not being used. He experienced it as a sudden realization. He then had the sensation that his familiar unhappy self suddenly died or disappeared through a black hole of some kind. And then there was a voice or something more like a sensation, though it was a kind of communication. So Tolle did use the term voice to describe it, though he said it wasn't words exactly, that told him, don't resist. Don't resist. He said at that moment he must have fallen asleep. The next morning, he said that everything seemed fresh, new, and alive. The objects in the room were very present to him now, whereas the night before they had seemed oddly distant and alien to him. A deep sense of peace enveloped him. And he walked out that day and headed into the city center, experiencing the intensity and resonance of life in a dramatically new way. Now, it took him 7 to 8 years, according to his estimate, to figure out what had happened to him. And during the first couple of years after this awakening, he just seemed to wander around the city in a state of bliss, often sitting on park benches, just soaking in the brilliance of people walking and the fountains and the trees and the flowers. Now, I can imagine that if a psychologist had encountered him, they would have pathologized his experience and put him on medication. How did such a thing happen? Well, Tolle characterized his experience as a random event, yet psychologists who study such occurrences of sudden and seemingly spontaneous spiritual awakenings, and they're few actually, not the majority, will tell us there is a definite pattern to such phenomena. As I mentioned briefly before, they speak of the common thread of a prolonged, dark emotional period of distress that precedes the spiritual breakthrough. The great American psychologist William James said of such dramatic spiritual upheavals that they are most likely to occur in those in darkest despair. He says the securest way to the rapturous sort of happiness of which the twice born make report has, as an historic matter of fact, been through a more radical pessimism, i.e., a dark depression, than anything we have yet considered. Now, let's move on to a different model. Kundalini Awakening is another spiritual phenomenon that is characterized by suddenness, though that's a little misleading because it usually takes years of Kundalini yogic practice before the sudden, powerful awakening occurs. And yet the way it has been presented on YouTube is as a kind of shortcut to a powerful experience of enlightenment. The classical Eastern way toward awakening is by a meditative practice that looks way too intense and painful, contorting one's body in a terribly uncomfortable position for at least a half hour or so, morning and evening, for about 20 years or more. And this method just doesn't excite many Westerners, I'm afraid. And in Kundalini Yoga, you have to sit in this position as well. But in contrast to the classical way of yogic meditation, Kundalini Yoga is a meditative practice which promises a dramatic and powerful life-changing experience, and usually in a quicker way. And so it is becoming very popular, especially among those who actively seek a dramatic awakening. Now, this type of awakening has been documented in tantric and yogic scriptures since the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. It involves a spiritual energy or life force rising up through our chakras, which are the centers of energy along the spinal column, leading up from our coccyx, which is our butt bone, all the way up to the crown of our head. This energy is often compared to a snake tightly coiled in dormancy at the base of our spine, which slowly rises up during meditative practice. In fact, that is what the Sanskrit word Kundalini refers to, a coiled serpent. Here you see on the left a color painting of a Tibetan tantric meditator. And those iconic images moving along the line of the spinal column represent the chakras and the path of the Kundalini energy. Now on the right is a modern rendition of the same information. Again, the chakras are major energy points in the body, and each energy point releases a different kind of energy, as you can see in the description. The very bottom chakra is energy for survival. And then above that, there's sex energy, and then the energy of power, then love energy, then expression, then perception, the mental aspect, and then spirituality at the crown of the head. Wikipedia describes the details of the practice as follows. The practice of, and I might mispronounce this, so forgive me, the practice of kriyas, which is asceticism, study, and devotion, and meditations in Kundalini Yoga are designed to raise complete body awareness to prepare the body, nervous system, and mind to handle the energy of Kundalini rising. The majority of the physical postures focus on navel activity, activity of the spine, and selective pressurization of body points and meridians. Breath work and the application of bandhas, which are described as 3 yogic locks, and forgive me, I've never experienced a yogic lock, so I can't give you more information on that. The application of bandhas aid to release, direct, and control the flow of Kundalini energy from the lower centers to the higher energetic centers. And here is another description, again from the Frontiers in Psychology website. They describe it this way. Kundalini energy lies dormant, coiled at the base of the spine until it is moved or awakened. As it uncoils, the energy makes its way up the central nadi, which is the subtle energy channels along the spine, adjacent to the spine, namely the Ida, which is the left channel, and the Pingala, which is the right channel, through the Sushumna, which is the central channel, piercing each chakra as it reaches Sahasrara. I'll try this again. Sahasrara, I guess if that's even close, which is the crown of the head. The settling of this energy at the crown of the head is said to provoke experiences of spiritual ecstasy or enlightenment. Whilst both terms, that is spiritual awakening and Kundalini awakening, while both terms are interchangeable and clearly overlap, Kundalini awakenings are typically associated with greater physical and energetic systems than general spiritual awakenings. Here's another diagram for you. I pulled it from the Wikipedia article on Kundalini Yoga. Now you can see on the left, the snake at the bottom of the spine, and on the right, the snake beginning to rise up. For the unawakened person on the left, the Kundalini energy is dormant. The energy channels are blocked. In the figure on the right, the Kundalini energy has already risen to the crown. When the spiritual energy of the Kundalini hits the crown, the fullness of a fluid called Amrita is released. Amrita literally means immortality and is often described as a nectar. As the snake of spiritual energy rises up our spine into each chakra point, this nectar of Amrita sort of seeps out, giving our body an experience of powerful energy. And once it reaches the crown, voila, we experience pure energy, kind of an explosion is how it's often described, and often an experience of bliss. Now, there is a word of caution for anyone interested in practicing Kundalini Yoga. Don't do it without the assistance of a teacher. You see, Kundalini releases energy, but sometimes this energy can move laterally away from the spine and central chakras out into the rest of the body, where it can cause burning sensations, intense spasms, vibrating, and jerking. It can cause grave mental disorientation. I'm sure it looks like somebody's being suddenly possessed by a demon when Kundalini Yoga goes wrong. And there are numerous instances of practitioners having a real psychotic breakdown as a result of this kind of yoga. And apparently, the more repressed trauma you have, the more dangerous this type of spiritual practice can be. So again, don't try this on your own. Have a teacher guide you if you're interested. Now, I want to briefly mention those spiritual hacks that have been used by spiritual seekers for millennia. They are attempts to quicken the awakening process and are often grouped under the heading ascetic practices. They include all sorts of deprivations, fasting, sleep and sensory deprivation, exposure to temperature extremes, and the like. Such practices are supposed to help us detach from the material world in order to rest in a spiritual state of being. We learn to control very quickly our desire for physical comfort, and thus we learn to detach ourselves from desire and clinging for those things. Now, ascetic practices do work. Otherwise, they would not have been passed down by teachers for several millennia. But personally, I'll confess this, as a spoiled Westerner, I do prefer a gentler way. How about you? Well, according to the history of the Buddha, he agrees with me. He tried ascetic practices and gave them up in exchange for something he called the middle way. Now, I would like to close this morning by telling the story of a few people, but it begins with the story of an American businessman who lived during the first half of the 20th century. He'd come from a prominent New England family who expected prominent accomplishments from their son. His name was Roland Hazard III, but everyone called him Roy. Roy delivered on his family's expectations by founding and managing several different business enterprises. His outward success, however, disguised a life of deep personal suffering. Roy, over the years, had become a hopeless alcoholic. That term hopeless was delivered as a death blow by one of the most famous psychiatrists in the world, Carl Jung. When you have a lot of money, you can afford the best treatment. So Roy visited Carl Jung. But unfortunately, even the great Swiss psychologist failed at curing Roy of his alcoholism. Here is how Jung presented his prognosis to the distraught businessman. Quote, "You have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I have never seen one single case recover where that state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you." Wow, that's not very hopeful, is it? Well, Roy was beside himself with sadness. And before leaving Jung, asked in desperation, "Is there no exception?" "Yes," replied Jung, "there is. Exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men, are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. In fact, I've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangement within you. With many individuals, the methods which I employed are successful, but I have never been successful with an alcoholic of your description." Well, believe it or not, Roy was actually hopeful at this point, despite the words of hopelessness from Jung, because he was a good church-going person. But Jung told him, despite his religious convictions, these were not good enough to bring about the vital spiritual experience. Roy came back to the United States and discovered a Christian organization called the Oxford Group that held to four great absolutes: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. He joined the group, followed its teachings, receiving encouragement and inspiration within the fellowship. And within months, not years, he experienced a spiritual awakening which relieved him of his craving for alcohol. Hazard would then share his experience with another friend of his who had also been written off as a hopeless alcoholic. That friend was Ebby Thatcher, whom you see on the right in this photo. Thatcher then experienced his own spiritual awakening, relief from the craving for alcohol. And he in turn shared his experience with an old drinking buddy, also written off as completely hopeless. That friend was named Bill Wilson, whom you see on the left. You might recognize that name. Bill Wilson was the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Wilson's own account of spiritual awakening is even more remarkable. In fact, it's very much like Saul's experience on the road to Damascus that we examined 2 weeks ago. In his own words, Bill describes it thus: "My depression deepened unbearably. And finally, it seemed to me as though I were at the bottom of the pit." So just like with Eckhart Tolle's experience, when it comes to sudden spiritual awakening, the night is definitely darkest just before dawn. He goes on, "I still gagged badly on the notion of a power greater than myself. Ebby Thatcher told him he needed to surrender to such a power if he wanted to be free of his alcoholism. But finally, just for the moment, the last vestige of my proud obstinacy was crushed. All at once, I found myself crying out, 'If there is a God, let him show himself. I am ready to do anything, anything.'" So here's the moment, like with Tolle, of surrender, of no longer resisting. So we see the pattern again: deep emotional darkness, followed by complete surrender. Bill goes on, "Suddenly the room lit up with a great white light. I was caught up into an ecstasy which there are no words to describe. It seemed to me in the mind's eye that I was on a mountain and that a wind, not of air, but of spirit, was blowing. And then it burst upon me that I was a free man. Slowly, the ecstasy subsided. I lay on the bed, but now for a time I was in another world, a new world of consciousness. All about me and through me, there was a wonderful feeling of presence. And I thought to myself, so this is the God of the preachers. A great peace stole over me, and I thought, no matter how wrong things seem to be, they are still all right." So here he experiences a profound detachment from his previous self and previous life. Now, I'm telling you this story for a couple of reasons. One, sometimes a vital and sudden spiritual awakening is necessary to deliver us from a life full of suffering, one that seems hopeless in many respects, whether because of an addiction or a dark depression or because of health or financial problems. Only a, quote, miracle of transformation, unquote, will seemingly deliver us. Carl Jung was right in that regard about such sudden awakenings occurring when people are in their darkest moments. And if you find yourself in such a situation, many other psychologists agree with William James as well. We are most susceptible to a dramatic and transforming spiritual experience when in the darkest times of our lives. However, that brings me to the second reason I told you this story. We don't need to rely on a spontaneous and sudden spiritual experience in order to have a spiritual experience. Like Roy Hazard and Ebby Thatcher, we can actually make a decision to be patient and follow a proven path. It might be the path of a 12-step program. Whether we have an addiction or not, it actually works for anybody. It might be the 5-stage path of the Christian mystic, or the path spelled out by Nichiren Buddhism. Or it could be one of a dozen other paths that history has proven effective. Whichever one we might choose, it only need begin with a seeker's heart and mind, born out of a simple decision to awaken. With Roy Hazard and Ebby Thatcher, their transformations did not take years. Theirs may not have been instantaneous, but their awakening apparently occurred only over a matter of weeks or months of seeking and surrendering, rather than years or decades. So you might say their awakening was kind of a middle way between it taking years and occurring suddenly. But Bill Wilson's was sudden and dramatic. It seems to me the determining factor in how sudden the awakening is how dark our life is and the degree to which we stop resisting. The more willing we are to surrender to the experience and where it is leading us, the more sudden it is. The path to sudden awakening may begin in the darkest despair, but remember, the path to any awakening, no matter how long the journey, begins with seeking, followed by surrender. My own spiritual awakening, and I've had 2 major ones in my life, both began as a seeker. The second awakening of mine began purely as an intellectual one, a philosophical curiosity about the meaning of life. In between many contemplative trips to art museums, I investigated existentialism and Buddhism and the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and the radical empiricism of William James and the pragmatism of John Dewey and philosopher Richard Rorty, and especially the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. I wasn't interested at the time in surrendering any part of myself, but that is exactly where my seeking ultimately led. Surrender. And surrender to my first love. How about you? Are you curious enough to explore life's meaning and your place in it? Or have you found yourself in a dark enough place that you are willing to let go and invite some higher power into your life? I'm curious. The floor is now open.